Hey guys, it's me Posey, and I'm here to tell you that the Owl House is really freaking great. But you may wonder, how did I get to this conclusion? And what led me to discover that? Well, let's start from the beginning. By the way, minor spoiler warning. So, I have always considered myself an enthusiast of 3D animation, and it's not just because it's the medium I myself use. I'm a pretty big Pixar person, and one of my favorite movies of recent times, The Mitchells vs. the Machines, is animated in 3D. As far as 2D animation goes, though, I wouldn't say I've had a lot of exposure to it, besides, SpongeBob and some of the other big episodic cartoons when I was a kid. But that's honestly a shame, because there's a lot of good 2D animated content if you're willing to look for it. Earlier this year, I finally got around to watching Gravity Falls, which is frankly just one of my favorite shows of all time. I could get into why that is some other time, but what's important for this current video is that Gravity Falls also pointed me in the direction of another show. A show with lots of similarities and connections to Gravity Falls, but one that is also fairly unique and holds up excellently on its own, and that show is The Owl House. I watched the first season of The Owl House expecting it to be good and that I'd like it, but that's not what ended up happening. No, it wasn't just good. It was great, and I really loved it. There's so much that deserves to be praised, so much so that I could never hope to go over it all. Like Gravity Falls, it's become one of my favorite 2D animated shows, and while I don't think The Owl House is as legendary as Gravity Falls, I have to admit that it does come shockingly close, and much to my surprise, there are legitimately things it does better than the other. So, where do I start, really? There's a lot to bring up, but I'll try to make this as well organized as I can. So without further ado, let's get right into this. So basically, The Owl House is a Disney show with 2 seasons created by Dana Terrace, who to my knowledge used to work on Gravity Falls, and is also dating Alex Hirsch, who created that show. So yeah, all things considered, it was only natural that the 2 shows would have some commonalities, with The Owl House taking inspiration from the other. And I must emphasize the word inspiration, because I would never consider The Owl House a copy or a ripoff of Gravity Falls. While they do share some aspects, The Owl House also has many original aspects and takes inspiration from other places as well. So like I said before, it stands out on its own. The story follows Luz Noseda, a very eccentric human teenager who is being sent to summer camp due to her antics and shenanigans. However, instead of going to camp, she discovers a gateway to another dimension and goes through, only to find herself in a fantasy land known as the Boiling Isles. Immediately, she meets an outcast witch named Ida, who takes her to her home, the Owl House.
He said it! He said it!
At the Owl House, she meets Hootie, who is pretty much the conscious manifestation of the house itself. And then there's King, an adorable tiny demon who also lives there. He's voiced by Alex Hirsch and pretty much talks exactly like Bill Cipher without the added effects. I won't lie, he's probably my favorite character in the whole show just because of how hilarious and lovable he is. Anyway, over the course of the show, Luz eventually enrolls at a magic school called Hexside, where she meets yet more characters. First there's Willow, the quiet and reserved girl who always serves as the voice of reason. Then there's Augustus, or Gus for short, and he's basically a hardcore human enthusiast. And then finally and most importantly there's Amity, who starts off as a cold, bully character but develops into a friend, and eventually a love interest for Luz. At least I hope so, since I haven't been able to watch season 2 yet. Essentially, the show functions in a similar way to a lot of cartoons where the episodes focus on the characters, their interactions, and the wacky situations they get themselves in. However, there is much more than just that, as the show takes a lot of time to focus on world building, lore building, setting up mysteries, and legitimately developing the characters instead of keeping them locked in an endless cycle of making mistakes, learning from them, and then immediately making the same mistakes again the next episode, like other cartoons. It's structured in the same sort of way a show like Gravity Falls is, because although it is still episodic, it also has an overarching story. In my opinion, that is my favorite kind of animated show because it serves as the best of both worlds. I love being able to see characters interact and do all sorts of fun stuff over and over again while also pondering the greater mystery in the background. It's a big part of why both shows worked for me. As far as the main cast goes, the characters are all really great and fun to watch. Luz, for example, serves as an excellent and relatable protagonist. She makes mistakes fairly often and can sometimes be reckless or clueless, but she has a kind heart and always tries to do the right thing, seeing the best in people even when they're at their worst. Luz is the perfect example of a realistic main character because instead of being flawless, she has flaws that she has to overcome over the course of the show, like Katie from The Mitchells vs. the Machines. I guess Luz may be slightly more relatable to me in particular because of her interest in fantasy and fanfiction, but that's pretty much just a cherry on top. Ida's great too. She reminds me a lot of Grunkle Stan from Gravity Falls in the sense that she's a bit of an irresponsible and unconventional parental figure but still cares greatly about Luz at the end of the day. Also, her voice actress does a fantastic job, major props to her. The characters each have varying degrees of complexity and charm, but there's at least something to appreciate about every one of them, except her, she's the worst. The dynamics between the characters too are just mwah, chef's kiss. I especially like the dynamic between Luz, Ida, and King, as well as the dynamic between Ida and her sister Lilith. But the rest are great too. It's just so much fun watching every single one of them. The comedy is also really great. It's not absolutely laugh out loud hilarious, but the jokes are mostly clever and entertaining, with my favorites being the references to fan fiction and fan culture, seeing as I can relate to those myself. It feels like the writers are incredibly well versed in their fan base, or at least fan bases in general, which is something I can always appreciate. Of course, there is one other character I really do need to talk about, and that's Amity. Now, she is a fan favorite, and I personally think that although King is funnier and more lovable, Amity is certainly the best written character of the show. She honestly feels like an upgraded version of Pacifica Northwest, another Gravity Falls character, although I don't mean to call Amity a copy, because, she's definitely her own character. Really, it's more like Pacifica is the beta test of Amity. They have the same general arc and development, but in Pacifica's case, she was redeemed in like 1 or 2 episodes in the second season, and then sort of sidelined for the rest of the show. Whereas Amity's development from bully to friend to love interest felt way more natural and had superior pacing. Although I still think Gravity Falls is the better show of the two overall, I would say Amity is Pacifica done better, and the Owl House improved on one thing Gravity Falls did earlier. And then there's Lumity, which is just the ship name for Luz and Amity. You see, Luz is canonically bisexual, whereas Amity is canonically lesbian, and as I mentioned prior, they gradually get closer and closer to being a couple over the course of the first season. And thankfully, this does not feel like it was done for the sake of pandering in the slightest. It feels genuine, natural, and as if it were from a place of genuine care. And it was, considering Dana Terrace herself is bisexual, as are several crew members who helped her out. But I digress, Lumity is just an amazing ship, and it's one I'm not ashamed to admit I wholeheartedly support. Honestly, Luz and Amity are just the perfect couple if you ask me. In the earlier episodes, Luz helps bring out the best in Amity, shattering her icy exterior and allowing her to open herself up to people again. As a result, Amity develops a massive crush on her, and in exchange she helps ground Luz in reality whenever she needs it. It's really fun and sweet to watch the two of them gradually grow closer and build off each other like a real actual couple, and believe me, as a devout progressive, nothing makes me happier than to see LGBT representation done right in media. Honestly, I'm shocked Disney even allowed this to happen, although as far as I know, they did put up a fight. Thankfully, they lost, because Lumity is just too precious. So enough about characters now, since I need to move on to another aspect of the show I really adore, which is the world building. The Boiling Isles is such a well fleshed out society. There's lots of time in the show dedicated to showing off the world in all its facets. We learn in detail how magic wielders are organized into covens, how the Emperor has a sphere of influence over the Isles, how the different magic academies function, how magic itself functions, and how life is for the average inhabitants. There's lots of diverse creatures living in the Boiling Isles, which is nice because the show could have chosen to be way lazier and make everyone an elf or something, and the world feels quite real, despite obviously being a fantasy world. Some parts of the world building are exposition and some are established via other methods, but regardless, it all works like a charm. And now for the visuals, which is another area the Owl House excels in, from the fluid animation to the excellent backgrounds and scenery to the interesting character designs, which fit their characters perfectly. I love the art style, it works wonders for the show. I think the animation is pretty great and fluid overall, but it absolutely peaks during the fight scenes, and also the scene where Luz and Amity dance together in order to defeat a monster called Grom. Seriously, this just looks so damn nice. Major props to all the artists who worked on this show, they all did an incredible job. Last but not least, I need to talk about the story itself. I have to admit it's nothing groundbreaking or absolutely masterful, but it's still pretty great and engaging. The underlying mystery elements are super intriguing, and a lot of them have good payoff at the end of the season. Even if the story was weak though, it still wouldn't matter, because in my opinion, the characters, comedy, world building, visuals, and all the other aspects of the show would still be enough to redeem it. So yeah, in conclusion, I think the Owl House is wonderful. It's definitely cemented itself as one of my favorite animated shows of all time, right up there with Gravity Falls. It's very clear just how much heart went into it, and I can't wait to see where things go in a second season, once it's available in Canada. If you're interested, I highly recommend hopping on Disney Plus and giving the show a watch. There's just so much to enjoy and so much to love. Major kudos to Dana Terrace and her team, because creating the Owl House might have just been one of the most massive W's I have ever seen. That's pretty much all there is for the video. As always, thanks for watching, and I'll see you all again when the time is right.